Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring science and sanity. My guest is Professor Rolf Sattler, who is Emeritus Professor of Biology at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. He is also a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He's a specialist, one of the world's foremost specialists, in fact, in plant morphology. He is the author of the award-winning book, Organogenesis of Flowers, as well as Biophilosophy, Analytic and Holistic Perspectives, as well as nearly 100 scientific papers. He has taught a course on biology and Zen at the Naropa Institute in Colorado and has also given an invited lecture on the life sciences and spirituality in honor of the Dalai Lama's 60th birthday. His newest book is Science and Beyond, Toward Greater Sanity Through Science, Philosophy, Art, and Spirituality. Professor Sattler is in Canada, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Rolf. It is a real pleasure to have you with me today on New Thinking Aloud.
Thank you, Jeff. The pleasure is mine. I'm delighted that we can talk about such an interesting topic.
Well, you have spent your career as a scientist, so obviously you know the value of science, and yet at the same time you seem to be cautioning people that science can be a very dangerous tool when it's misused, and I'm under the impression that the misuse of science is very considerable.
Yes, and I am very concerned about that. And that's one reason why I wrote my book, because I think it can have grave and even catastrophic consequences. Yes, I'm very, very much concerned about this misuse. And there are many, many ways in which it can be misused. And often not intentionally, only because people are not aware of the foundations of science. And they have all sorts of unrealistic beliefs about science.
Well, I think one of those beliefs, which is pretty well known in my field of parapsychology, is the idea that science can prove something. My good friend Stanley Krippner often says, I accept the word of proof when it comes to liquor, but not science.
Yes, and this belief is so widespread among the general population, among government officials, and also among many scientists, to my great surprise. And it's so obvious that we cannot have proof in science because science is open-ended. There's no final word in science. If we make observations or experiments that appear to prove our hypothesis, we cannot know whether a repetition of these observations or experiments in the future will again, quote, prove it. So we just don't know the future, and for that reason, it's impossible to prove something in science. And yet we can I read it all the time, scientifically proven, and so on and so on. And it's astounding to me why this is so widespread. But it has also something to do with politics, I think.
Is a comfortable feeling, I suppose, for people to think that there is a certainty. We can be absolutely sure of X, Y, or Z. But even in philosophy and even in mathematics, proof is questionable. Mathematical proofs always depend on the postulates that you start with, which are taken as axiomatic, but they can also be questioned.
Yes, yes, it's true. It's true, and the consequences of this wrong belief, I mean, are really very serious. One consequence is that if we believe that something has been proven, that closes the door to further investigation. Why should we look for anything else if we know we've proven it, right? And furthermore, it leads to a kind of dogmatism. I mean, we know the truth, we know it's proven, and so it tends to become dogmatic, and it also may support a certain aggressiveness against those who don't believe in your proof. So these are very unfortunate consequences for individuals and for society.
Well, there are many areas of human endeavor that science doesn't begin to touch. Consciousness is probably the most significant one of all. Science seems to have no good explanation for consciousness.
But there are some people now who think, scientists, philosophers, who think that actually consciousness is primary. And the scientific and medical network, together with the Institute of Noetic Sciences and the Academy of Post-Materialist Science, organized 2 symposia about this question and advancing arguments for the notion that consciousness is primary, not matter, but consciousness. And that explains phenomena like near-death experiences, and of course many parapsychological phenomena with which you are very familiar. So this to me is an interesting turn to consider the idea that consciousness is primary and not matter. And that, of course, changes also how we look at the brain, because then the brain is no longer the seat where consciousness originates. The brain then becomes more or less a filtering system that filters out certain aspects, and that to me is fascinating. And I think there is considerable evidence for looking at it this way. But this discussion has been going on for a long time, as you know, and there has been a lot of resistance. For example, at the beginning of the last century, Max Planck, one of the founders of quantum physics, already said that consciousness is fundamental. And yet, where are we today? I think today the materialist paradigm is still the predominant paradigm. And people who don't subscribe to it are often ridiculed, or their ideas are suppressed or even censored. So we haven't made a lot of progress in this respect, but I'm not giving up, and I'm not. I don't want to be too pessimistic. Sometimes it just takes a very long time.
I am under the impression, Rolf, that your interest in plant morphology has drawn you into a mystical reality, that you see that plants are pointing toward, especially beautiful flowers and their mandala-like shapes are pointing us towards that which I think you refer to as the unnameable, things that we can never even speak about, but science can point towards them.
Yes. Oh, yes. I think I've really learned a lot from plant morphology, and I've been very inspired by a British plant morphologist, Agnes Arber, who wrote several books, one on the natural philosophy of plant morphology, and her last book, actually a rather mystical book entitled The Manifold and the One. And one thing she said was, if plant morphology, like other specialized disciplines, seem to be a very narrow path but if correctly pursued, it may lead to infinite issues. And this is exactly what happened in my life. I started with plant morphology. In university, I was also indoctrinated, and I believed in the materialist paradigm, and plants are just a manifestation of matter. And I pursued it more and more, and the more I pursued it, the more it led me beyond. And this, to me, has been really fascinating.
Well, I know, for example, one of the great early scientists of plant and plant morphology was Goethe, who most people don't even think of Goethe as a scientist. People think, oh, he was a dramatist and a poet. But actually, he did a lot of scientific work, and he seemed to feel that the archetypal images of poetry are also expressed in the world of plants.
Yes, he is considered one of the founders of plant morphology. He wrote this little booklet called The Metamorphosis of Plants. When he made a trip to Italy, he got inspired there, and he came back, and then he wrote this book. And this is considered a cornerstone in plant morphology. But he also made remarks that are not so well known, that go far beyond what he wrote in his booklet on metamorphosis of plants, and remarks that actually came close to those of Agnes Arber, who had a very different outlook, because many plant morphologists, even today, still have a very categorical outlook. They say a plant consists of three major organs: roots, stems, and leaves, and everything you observe must be either one or the other. So you see, there is an Aristotelian logic implied, and either Aristotelian either or logic, either this or that. And Agnes Arber could see beyond this logic and could embrace more of both and logic. I think one could even say that she was inspired by yin-yang thinking. I'm not sure about that, but it's very much in line with yin-yang thinking, her way of thinking. And mine, of course, also I also pursued this kind of thinking then. That's actually one thing that attracted me to your website. When I saw your beautiful yin-yang symbol, I was so impressed, and I want to congratulate you on it. I mean, how you did that with the colors, this is just astounding. And to me, the yin-yang symbol and the thinking on which it's based is so fundamental. I wish it would be much more appreciated. I taught for a long time a course on the history of biology. And I started this course with a comparison of Western thinking and Chinese thinking, Aristotelian logic versus yin-yang thinking. And I think that if in our culture we would have had more appreciation of yin-yang thinking, the course of history might actually have been different. Because it's so fundamental, and it changes things so fundamentally, because in our culture, even today, and also in science still to a great extent, people keep asking, is it this or that? Is it good or evil? Is it right or wrong? And so on. This seems to be so deeply ingrained. And if we could appreciate yin-yang, we would see that it could be both, right? So it makes an enormous difference.
The idea that seems fundamental to me about the yin-yang symbol is that everything contains within itself the seed of its own opposite.
Exactly, yes. And also yin flows gradually into yang and vice versa. So it's contrary to the law of the excluded middle in Aristotelian logic, where it has to be either this or that. One can see a continuum. And this has been the idea of a continuum has been very important for me in plant morphology, because First of all, it's quite obvious that there is a continuum between the root and the stem. Yet many morphologists try to find the limit between the two, but it's a continuum. Also, there's a continuum between the stem and the leaves. Actually, a colleague of mine wrote an article about the stem node leaf continuum. So this idea of a continuum has been very important. And also there is a continuum between categories, like the categories root, stem, and leaf. So the idea of a continuum is very important. And that is very much in line with what's called now fuzzy logic. Fuzzy logic was invented in the 60s, and then Bart Kosko published a book in the 90s on fuzzy logic or fuzzy thinking that I found extremely important. But again, this is not very much appreciated in our culture. In our culture, as soon when you refer to fuzziness, this is considered something negative, and people think, oh, well, he cannot make up his mind. Is it this or that? And so on. It's imprecise and so on. But actually, fuzzy logic is much more precise than either or logic, because it shows precisely to what degree anything is a member of a certain set. So that is not very much appreciated. And I find it really amazing. I have given talks about fuzzy logic and so on, and I had many negative reactions often. Oh, this man cannot make up his mind, and he's confused, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about that. But again, I think it's very clear in the yin-yang symbol and in the thinking, the gradual change from one to the other. It's not just at one point totally yang or totally yin. It goes gradually one in the other, as you know very well.
Well, you, I understand, are a member of the Linnaean Society. Linnaeus, as I understand with my limited knowledge, was the developer of the whole field of classification and categories. And the large categories, I think the very big ones are known as kingdoms: the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, the mineral kingdom. Would you say that there are fuzzy boundaries between these kingdoms?
Fungi are a good example. They never fitted very well into the animal kingdom and not very well into the plant kingdom. I mean, like plants, they don't move around, but like chemically, they have something in common with animals. So they were shifted around back and forth. Now, one way to get out of this dilemma is make it a separate kingdom. So now they are separate. But I think this is not a final solution of the continuum problem to just create then a new class. I think the continuum remains. So yes, I think there's a lot of continuity. And actually, it's not surprising. Evolution was a more or less gradual process. And so you would expect a continuity and not totally abrupt changes that would justify classifications.
Well, since you bring up the theory of evolution, usually referred to as Darwin's theory or evolution by natural selection, many people regard that as proven. I think it's pretty standard in the biological sciences to assume that the theory of evolution is the framework within which we can understand all of biology. How do you view that?
Well, there is a confusion about theory of evolution and Darwinism. There are different theories of evolution, and the Darwinian theory is only one, but that's the predominant one, and that's the one you still find in textbooks. And I think one cannot deny that there is some truth, some aspect of truth in Darwinian thinking. but it's too limited, I think. And there is now a theory considered, or a number of theories considered, extended evolutionary theory that goes beyond Darwinism. In these extended theories, there's a recognition, for example, of self-organization, or there's much more a recognition of cooperation, because, as you know, in Darwinism, struggle and competition is considered fundamental, and so cooperation has been very much neglected. And if one looks in the index of a biology book, you often don't find cooperation at all. You may find many entrance to competition, but not cooperation. But there's much cooperation in nature. Even Darwin has pointed that out, but this has been overlooked by neo-Darwinians, who often have been more Darwinian than Darwin himself. So it's interesting, I think, that there's gradually some recognition of other forces in evolution besides chance and selection through competition. But the alternative theories are still more or less at the periphery. As far as I can see, Darwinian thinking is still predominant, and that fits in, of course, very well with capitalism, where competition is also very important. And it fits in very well with the military complex, again, where competition is very important. So for these reasons, I think it's not easy to change that. And there is a lot of resistance to these more extended evolutionary theories.
Earlier, you talked about the notion first promulgated, well, not first, but promulgated by Max Planck, that consciousness is fundamental rather than matter. That seems as if it's turning science upside down on its head completely. But if we assume, well, before I ask if we assume, let me ask you, do you subscribe to that view?
As a student, of course, I did not, because I was indoctrinated, and it took me some time to see beyond that. But having been a member of the scientific and medical network, I could see beyond that, and I think there is much merit to this view. But I would prefer to actually. You've referred already to the unnameable. I would prefer to say the ultimate reality is unnameable, and then out of this unnameable comes consciousness and also matter. So I would be sort of maybe somewhere in the middle, but I would tend to see consciousness as more fundamental as matter. Mm-hmm. But then the unnameable to me is still more fundamental. And here I was very much impressed by Korzybski, to whom I also dedicated my book. As you know, Korzybski wrote a very important book entitled Science and Sanity. Was published in 1933. And this book has had an enormous influence on me, because he pointed out the importance of abstraction, that we are often not aware how we abstract from reality. We talk and we use concepts and language, and we think that's it. But language is an abstraction, so language is not the thing. You know, his famous slogan was, the map is not the territory, and language is, of course, a certain map. And then if language is considered a map, then and not the territory, then what Korzybski said is, whatever you may say, it's not it. Or whenever you say what something is, it's not it. Why not? Well, because it's formulated in language, and language does not touch reality. Actually, I don't know whether people can see behind me. I have a diagram of Korzybski's structural differential, in which he showed, that what we do when we use language, we select certain features from reality, and they are reflected in language. But it's a selection. It's not reality itself. So it's a selection or an abstraction. Abstraction literally means to select or to withdraw from something. And this is often not appreciated, but that is so fundamental. And so I have learned very much from Korzybski, and I wish the world would learn more from Korzybski, because I think his impact, his discovery and his work has been so important.
Well, it seems as if what you're saying is that when we confuse words for reality, or concepts or theories for reality, that we are entering into a realm of insanity, or something less than being completely sane. We're making a very serious confusion.
Yes, yes. And you know, the subtitle of my book is Toward Greater Sanity. So I'm very much interested in sanity, but I don't understand sanity just in the medical or psychiatric sense. To me, sanity means understanding and being in tune with reality. And if we don't recognize abstraction, then of course we are not in tune. We don't understand, and we are not in tune with reality. And so this creates a certain insanity. And so Korzybski has pointed out, you know, when we are not aware that whatever we say is not it, then it's becoming insane. And so that means actually that a lot what's going on in this world is insane, which is surprising to many people. I would say involves a degree of insanity or some delusion.
One would think that we do live in an insane world when you consider that in the name of science and rationality, we are polluting the planet. We are making war with members of our own species. We are destroying the environment that we need to survive. All of these things suggest that we are living in less than a sane world.
Yes, I agree. And also, I think one insanity is to believe that science will actually lead us to the truth. I think science can lead us at best to some aspects of the truth, but not the truth. And one reason why it cannot lead us to the truth is because in science, we use language, or mathematics, a form of language. And since language is an abstraction from reality, it obviously cannot be the truth or the whole truth. It can be at best a part of it. But you know, in our culture and society, the view that science can lead us to the truth is very common. And therefore, whatever is beyond science is considered imagination, fantasy, or a personal, irrelevant pursuit, but not the truth. And I am very concerned about these aspects that are beyond science, like art, you know, like music, and or like spirituality, where we experience reality not in terms of language and concepts and logic, but in a more direct way. That may be also illusory sometimes, but at least it's an alternative that should not be discounted. But it is discounted if we believe that science leads us to the truth. So why look for something else, right? We have it, and that can be very catastrophic, can have catastrophic consequences, I think, as you pointed out.
Well, you seem to be going even further, because not only are you saying that science cannot lead us to the truth, but any endeavor that is expressed in language will always fall short of the truth.
And that's, of course, a problem in our culture, in our society, in politics, in personal relationships. When you talk to your beloved, I mean, you may end up in great misunderstandings because of language. And sometimes it may be better to just communicate in silence. And I have emphasized very much silence in my book for that reason, because ultimately, I think it cannot be said. And so one can be, maybe there is a possibility to be in truth in silence, but not through words. Words are limited.
You, in fact, have meditation exercises throughout your new book, and you seem to be suggesting that these exercises can take a person to a place of understanding beyond words.
Yes, and that is very important for me. So that's why I included these exercises. But the editor of my book thought this should be cut out. That is really irrelevant. But I persisted. And the other thing that also was not very looked upon, not favorably looked upon, is the jokes I included in the book, because jokes to me are also very important. Because if one uses language, one can, and concepts and logic, one can become too serious, whereas a joke, I think, sometimes can jolt you out of the seriousness, and by laughing, one can actually contact an aspect of reality that may be deeper than one that can be reached through words. And actually, one thing, I have been retired now for a long time. One thing I pursued during my retirement was laughter yoga. In laughter yoga, one meets with a group and one does some simple exercises that make us laugh. And if one does that for half an hour or an hour, it can be amazing how you feel afterwards. You feel somewhat free or liberated in a way which you cannot reach through language. So laughter has been very important to me. I started laughing already with my students. During exam time, sometimes the atmosphere was very tense, and at the end of a lecture, I would just burst out into laughter, and the students would join me, and we laughed together for a few minutes and so on. And this has been so wonderful for the students, and for me, it also has created a bond. And I think laughter can do really miracles almost, I would say. And so laughter in silence, I would consider very important.
As if laughter can take one to a mystical place, to an altered state of consciousness.
Yes. Oh, yes, I think so. Yes, I agree.
You seem to be suggesting then that really, in order to practice science, one has to include in one's personal discipline some of these nonverbal approaches to reality.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether one has to. I think one can do science without that. But if one can include that, I think that would lead to a deeper understanding and deeper level, and could open vistas that would not be possible without that. So yes, I think this can be very helpful. And I think great scientists have made comments in this regard. You can find quotations supporting that by Albert Einstein, for example. I have this quotation at the top of my book where he says, the most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. So great scientists often have been very tuned into this, what goes beyond words. And Einstein is one example. Schrödinger and others are other examples. There's a biologist, Barbara McClintock. She was very inspired by Tibetan Buddhism, and one of her famous quotes, is basically everything is one. And if one operates from this realization, I think that can be very helpful in science.
The idea that all is one is basic to virtually every mystical tradition on the planet.
Yes. Yeah.
I like to think when I do interviews that the best interviews come around to that situation as well. And to me, what it means is that if you love yourself, which is, I think most people would consider a goal, self-love is a healthy thing. Now, I don't mean egotistical self-love, but in the deeper sense of the self, it also suggests to me loving the whole universe.
Yes. Oh, yes. I think this oneness is very important. And in science, of course, there is now much evidence for interconnectedness and oneness. It took us a long time to learn that, but it has become very obvious in ecology. But I think one must also reach this feeling of oneness through one's own experience. And that to me was very important to reach it through, let's say, meditation or other practices or just spontaneous insights. And to me, this convergence of what's found in science, the oneness found in science, and the oneness that one can experience personally is a very important discovery, because I think we have to recognize the third person and first person perspectives, and bringing these together through oneness to me has been very important.
It seems as if the third person perspective is one of division. It starts, I suppose, with the division between me and the rest of the universe. And you seem to be suggesting that division, which is sort of natural to language itself and to individual consciousness, is something of an illusion.
Yes, I think it is. Well, there may be some partial validity to it, because although I am one with the universe, I am still somewhat, as a person, somewhat differentiated. And so I think one has to see both. For me, there's great wisdom in the Heart Sutra that says form is emptiness and emptiness is form. So one has to recognize the forms that are separate or can be distinguished, let's say, and the emptiness that is boundless and that is unified and that is one. And therefore, to me, a sort of non-dualistic view is very attractive, where one recognizes the manifold and the one. Therefore, I appreciate so much the title of Agnes Arber's last book called The Manifold and the One, recognizing both, but not just one or the other. Because I think there's a tendency in some spiritual circles to just dwell in the one and to disregard or neglect the many. And of course, in science, it's the opposite, to just dwell in the many and often disregard the one. So I think it's important to bring the two together. And this has been important to me in my life. And I think this has been also important to quite a number of authors who have written on the relation between science and spirituality.
It seems as if your fundamental message, Rolf, is one of balance.
Yes. Oh, exactly. Yes, balance, and that's again, of course, very important in Taoism, in Yin Yang. Yin and Yang have to be balanced, and if they are not balanced, well, it leads to sickness. And I think, in a way, we can see that our society, our culture is sick because there's so much emphasis on yang and not enough on yin. And therefore, the balance is so important. And to me, it's important intellectually, but it's also important experientially. And that's why I practice Qigong and Tai Chi, where the balance is really very important, though, where it's expressed and where it's instilled in my own being. Yes, balance is very important. And you know that according to Chinese thinking, health is actually defined as balance. That's a very important definition of health, I think. In contrast, in Western medicine, there is very little talk about health. There's more talk about sickness, and of course, not very much talk about balance. And I think that's a big problem.
One of the issues that I found really fascinating in your book was your description of the human condition. And when we look at the human condition, you suggest one of the first things we have to take into account is that we are primates. And we have primate cousins that we can study and learn about ourselves by observing them.
Yes. Oh, yeah, that is very important for me. And I've read a book by Frans de Waal, who is a primatologist, who pointed out how much we actually, in our behavior, well, genetically, of course, we are very similar to chimpanzees and bonobos, but how much we have also in common in terms of our behavior. We have, for example, in common this drive for power, which is very important in chimpanzees, to be the alpha male. That we have in common. But we also have in common chimpanzees can be very altruistic, and they can show empathy. And so we have already both of that, what we find in human society, the egotistical trait and the altruistic trait we find in chimpanzees and other primates and other animals. And so I think it's very important to be aware of it. But again, this can get out of balance. And it may have been, I don't know, I'm not a specialist on chimpanzees. It might have been a bit out of balance already in chimpanzees. Bonobos, in contrast to chimpanzees, are much less egotistical, much less power-driven. As you may know, they solve most of their problems through sex, and so they cooperate a lot. When chimpanzees intrude a new territory, they fight and they may kill to get a better fruit tree or whatever. When bonobos intrude into a new territory, they don't fight. They have sex with the other bonobos in the territory. So they are peaceful, very peaceful. And it seems that we may have maybe a bit too much in common with chimpanzees and not enough with bonobos. But I think we have the potential of both. So this can be corrected and this can be changed, I think. Then, of course, talking about the human condition, what is new in humans is language and logic and yes, and that is it contributes, of course, as you have already pointed out, to the division, because language divides, and if we are not aware of it, then of course we get more division, which is a basis then for competition, which reinforces the competition. And so the human condition is, as I see it, very much a result of our animal ancestry, and then the introduction of language and a lack of realization of the limitation of language. I'm not against language. I think it's wonderful to communicate through language, but I think the problem is not being aware of the limitations of language. The problem is not language. We need it in many ways, but the awareness we need also, and that's often lacking.
Well, it seems the same is true of science, that the problems of science, the social problems generated by science, are largely caused by a lack of appreciation for the limits of science.
Yes. Oh, yes. I think that's one of the major problems in our culture, not being aware of the limits of science. And this is not sufficiently taught in school and university, I find. In contrast, we often are taught the great successes of science, and of course science has had great successes, but the limitations are so important, and I wish this would be more pointed out in school and universities, and this would also have a very beneficial effect then on our culture and society and our individual lives. And one reason for writing my book was exactly this, to point out the limitations of science. And the consequences of not being aware of them.
Well, you've done a masterful job. I highly recommend your book to our viewers. It seems as if what you've been able to do is encapsulate very clearly your many, many decades of thoughtful inquiry into this area, the limitations of science, the limitations of language, the limitations of our whole culture because it's out of balance. So, Professor Rolf Sattler, thank you so much for being with me today.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for this interview. It's a pure delight talking with you because the questions you ask and the comments you make are so helpful, and they really lead to a most interesting discussion that I enjoyed immensely. So thank you very much, Jeff.
And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us.